If you've ever just assumed that human beings are fundamentally logical creatures, or that cause and effect is some sort of unbreakable law of the universe, well, prepare to have your entire worldview completely dismantled. Let's dive into this explainer and use our epistemological microscope to bust some of the absolute biggest philosophical myths of the 18th century. Today, we're looking at David Hume's monumental work, An Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Hume wasn't just a philosopher, he was practically a cognitive anatomist. He wanted to map exactly what the human mind can, and maybe more importantly, cannot, actually know.
Starting off with Section 1, Mapping the Human Mind and the Anatomy of Thought. To build a true science of the mind, we first have to figure out what our thoughts are actually made of, right? We can't talk about logic or belief until we know the basic building blocks of human cognition. And Hume argues that literally everything in our mind falls into one of two distinct buckets, and it's all based on intensity. First, we have impressions. These are your lively, immediate, forceful perceptions, like actually physically feeling the searing heat of a campfire or experiencing a sudden, intense flush of anger. Then we have ideas. These are just the faint, indirect thoughts you have when you merely remember that fire or reflect on being angry days later. So the crucial takeaway here is that even your absolute wildest imagination is just a faint copy of something you've directly experienced or felt in the real world.
Okay, let's see how this actually works in action. Step 1. You experience a direct sensory impression. Step 2. Your brain forms a faint copy of it, which becomes an idea. And Step 3. Your imagination can take these simple ideas and just mix and match them into complex ones. I mean, think about it. You've seen gold and you've seen a mountain. Smash those two faint copies together in your head and boom, you can vividly imagine a golden mountain, even though one obviously doesn't exist. This brilliantly illustrates what Hume calls the copy principle. It shows that every abstract concept we possess has to start with basic sensory building blocks. Basically, if you can't trace an idea back to a sensory impression, Hume argues the idea is literally meaningless.
Now, what's kind of wild here is that Hume actually admits to one highly specific exception, imagining a missing shade of blue that you've never seen before. Imagine you've seen every shade of blue in existence except for one specific hue. If I showed you a color gradient with that one shade missing, could your mind fill in the blank? Hume actually says, yeah, probably. But honestly, he just waves it off as a bizarre anomaly. For all practical purposes, the copy principle holds firm. No impression, no idea.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, The Illusion of Logic and Deconstructing Cause and Effect.
This is the part where Hume literally pulls the rug right out from under centuries of scientific and philosophical assumptions. He argues that all human inquiry falls into one of two categories. This split, which is famously known as Hume's fork, draws a really hard line between absolute logical truths and everyday empirical observations. First, we have relations of ideas. This is pure math and logic. 3 times 5 is 15. You don't need to look outside to know that's true, and denying it creates an actual logical paradox. On the flip side, we have matters of fact. These rely entirely on observation. For example, the statement, "the sun will rise tomorrow," is a matter of fact. Why? Because the statement, "the sun will not rise tomorrow," isn't actually a logical contradiction. I mean, it's super unlikely, sure, but your brain can perfectly imagine a dark sky tomorrow morning without breaking any mathematical laws.
So, if matters of fact aren't proven by pure logic, how do we know anything about the physical world at all? Picture this. Imagine 2 perfectly smooth billiard balls on a table. Without relying on any of your past experience, could you use pure a priori logic to predict what happens when one hits the other? Hume's answer is a resounding absolute no. Just by looking at a moving ball, logic alone cannot tell you if it's going to bounce back, stop completely, or make the second ball move.
Think about what your eyes actually witness in that moment. Step 1, ball A moves. Step 2, ball A hits ball B. Step 3, ball B moves. That is literally it. We only observe a constant conjunction of events, basically just a sequence happening one after another. We do not observe some magical necessary connection binding them together. We all just assume there's a hidden logical force transferring energy, but Hume points out we never, ever actually see or experience that force. We just see the sequence.
And this leads us to a massively uncomfortable question. Why on earth do we just believe the future will resemble the past? Just because bread nourished you yesterday, why assume it's going to do the same thing tomorrow? This brings us to the absolutely devastating problem of induction. We have zero logical proof that the sun will rise tomorrow because we can't use past experience to prove that past experience is a reliable guide. That's totally circular reasoning. You can't just say, well, induction works because it's always worked in the past. Logic simply cannot guarantee our physical reality.
Which brings us right to Section 3. Habit guides our lives, the instinct of custom.
Okay, so if pure reason isn't running the show, what is? If we aren't rationally calculating that fire burns or that dropped objects fall, how are we even surviving? Well, Hume provides what he calls a skeptical solution. Reason does not guide our inductive beliefs. Instead, custom or habit is the true guide of life. When we see fire and heat together repeatedly, this repetition forms a natural mental association. You see the fire, and your mind just instantly expects the heat. And what is belief? Hume says a belief is simply an idea conceived with intense, vivid feeling transferred from our habits. The mind acts like a mechanical scale, weighing past outcomes and forming powerful habits that we just experience as deeply felt beliefs.
I mean, think about a dog hearing the rustle of a food bag and immediately sprinting to its bowl. That dog isn't doing complex probability math in its head, right? It's conditioned by habit. And Hume's point is, we're doing the exact same thing. Human beings are instinct-driven creatures, much like dogs anticipating their food bowls. It is highly ironic, but the greatest breakthrough of Enlightenment reasoning basically concluded that our daily survival relies completely on animal-like instinct rather than complex logic. Nature just completely bypassed our slow, clunky reasoning and gave us a rapid-fire survival instinct instead, custom.
Let's dive into Section 4, Free Will and Miracles, applying empiricism to culture. Now that he's completely leveled our understanding of knowledge, Hume sets his sights on the heavy hitters of his time. First up, the age-old battle between determinism and free will. Hume defines necessity as the idea that actions are predictably caused by internal motives and character. And he defines liberty as the idea that actions flow from our choices without physical constraint. By redefining the terms, Hume makes a brilliant argument for compatibilism. He shows that free will and determinism aren't enemies at all. You actually need both for moral responsibility to even make sense. If our actions weren't caused by our predictable character, necessity, we couldn't be held accountable. And if we were physically forced to act, meaning we lacked liberty, we also couldn't be held accountable. You literally need both to have a functioning moral system. Next up, he takes on miracles, and he defines a miracle very strictly as a literal violation of the laws of nature. He leaves us with this absolute mic drop of a quote. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. This is Hume's famous maxim, and it sets an incredibly high bar for any historical claim that violates the laws of nature. Basically, he's asking, what's actually more likely here? That the fundamental, unyielding laws of biology just took a day off, or that someone is maybe mistaken, lying, or just exaggerating? When you really weigh the evidence, testimony for a miracle usually relies on weak, fallible evidence. It's often a handful of biased witnesses, fueled by human nature's deep passion for surprise and wonder. On the flip side, you have uniform human experience offering maximum empirical proof. We have billions of observations establishing the unyielding laws of biology and physics. When you weigh human error and our love for sensational stories against the uniform laws of physics, the sensible choice is always to reject the miracle testimony. Hume imparts a strict rule of empirical evidence. Always bet on the side with the most consistent historical data. And he applies this exact same razor-sharp logic to natural theology. Look around. The physical world is imperfect, right? It's full of chaos and suffering. Hume argues a strict rule of cause and effect here. We cannot infer more in the cause than is absolutely required to produce the observed effect. Therefore, based purely on observing a flawed world, we cannot logically infer a perfectly wise, perfectly benevolent creator. Furthermore, we can't just hypothesize an unseen future state like heaven just to fix the earthly injustices we observe. It's like finding a single footprint on a beach. That proves someone walked there, sure, but it doesn't prove the walker was a multilingual painter. An imperfect world doesn't prove a perfect creator. We can only infer exactly what is needed to make the footprint, and nothing more.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the sensible skeptic, a practical guide to life.
So after completely tearing down absolute logic, causation, and metaphysics, where on earth does that leave us? Does Hume want us to just collapse into an existential crisis where we doubt everything and refuse to even leave our beds? Not at all. That would be Pyrrhonian skepticism, extreme doubt that paralyzes all action. According to Hume, that is completely unlivable. Nature just won't let you do that. Eventually, you're going to get hungry and you're going to have to eat. which proves you trust reality enough to survive. Instead, Hume advocates for academic skepticism. This is a modest, tolerant worldview that accepts our cognitive limits and focuses on practical sciences rather than unanswerable mysteries. By accepting that our minds are limited and mostly driven by habit, we actually become less dogmatic, way more open to changing our minds, and a whole lot more grounded in reality.
Let's bring it all together and look at this summary. Hume's empirical correction completely rewrote the traditional rules of philosophy. Origin of ideas, not innate, they're just copies of sensory impressions. Causation, not some magical necessary connection, just a constant conjunction recognized by human habit. Inductive reasoning, not a logical assumption at all, it's just the instinct of custom. And free will, not opposed to necessity, but highly compatible with it. He took all of these lofty, abstract concepts and grounded them firmly and permanently in human psychology and empirical observation.
And that brings us to the dramatic, kind of fiery climax of his work. Hume concludes with this huge call to action, demanding we purge our libraries of any dogmatic metaphysics that aren't grounded in math or empirical fact. If a book doesn't contain mathematical reasoning or experimental reasoning about matters of fact, he literally says, commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
It's a really radical challenge to just strip away all the fluff and focus purely on what we can observe and measure. Which brings us to you. If our deepest beliefs are genuinely driven by habit rather than logic, what unquestioned assumptions in your own life need to be thrown into the flames? I leave you with this final thought. Grab your own epistemological microscope, deeply question your habits, and see exactly what survives the flames.
Please like and subscribe.